You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Welcome to this episode of Leading the Factory Forward. Today we're going to be talking about what's your plan for 2020. How can you get off to a great start with 2020 and some ideas about what you can do and how you can have the biggest impact as well as a strong start for 2020. This will be a 4-part series, and we're going to start with the basics of creating your plan for 2020. In the next episode, we'll talk about what are the habits of mind and habits of action you need, again, for that strong start for your 2020. The third episode, we'll talk about, could you use a coach? What is the purpose of coaching and how can it support you in a strong start in 2020? And then finally, I'm going to review some of the activities and things we've done in the 2019 podcast, as well as sharing some ideas and thoughts of where I'm going to try to take the podcast in 2020. But of course, as always, I welcome your feedback to let me know what you'd like to hear about as we think about the new year. So, thinking about your goals for 2020. Even now we're in early December, but think about how can you finish 2019 strong and then also get a really powerful start to 2020. How are you going to approach your goals for 2020? We're going to talk about that some today. And I'll suggest that as you think about these goals, we always tend to start with actions, things that we're going to do personally or physically, but also think about purpose. Why am I doing some of these things? I always go back to this quote, remember we are human beings and not just human doings. It's always a thing of why am I doing something, not just what am I doing and how much of it can I do. Now, I will suggest also that as you wrap up 2019, you may find there's things that aren't finished. And that's okay. Take a strong look at those, and rather than leave them weighing on you, maybe you just mark them complete. They're not done. They're just complete. You're not going to focus on them in 2020. It could be it was very useful in 2019, or maybe you just found it wasn't helping that much or giving that much impact. So in some cases, don't just try to drag everything from 2019 to 2020. Some things just say they're complete. Another thing as we talk about different things is, again, it's not just actions, but it's relationships. And we'll talk about this more, but just as an idea to spark your thinking, what are the 10 most important relationships you have? It could be at work, it could be at home, family, any number of things, friends. But who are those 10 people that you really want to have a great relationship with? Then finally, as you think about your work and your life, I always go back to this short story. A person came upon 3 people laying bricks, and he asked the first person, what do you do? He says, I just lay bricks. I come here and 8 hours a day I lay bricks and then I go home. And he asked the second person, so what are you doing? That person said, I'm a mason. I am great at being a mason and doing work, and I'm very proud of my work, and I want to share that pride and skills with other people. And then they asked the third person, what are you doing? And that person said, I'm building a cathedral. Here's a person who had stepped out of the activities and even the personal achievement arena, and they had committed themselves to doing something bigger than themselves. So again, keep those thoughts in mind as you try to capture goals. Another thing we'll talk about is, while we want to have big goals, we're also going to talk about how can we do small steps. So if you jump back to my podcast, episode number 25 on mini habits, I think that's a nice compliment. In other words, we need to have a big goal. Where are we really shooting for? Something, a real reach, stretch target, but understand we get there by very small steps. Now, a couple other things to consider as you go about capturing goals or thinking about goals. A couple of books. These are by Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz. They're a few years old now, but they're still excellent. Their first one was Corporate Athlete, and their second one was The Power of Full Engagement. But in both those books, they basically talk about how energy is the key to any performance. It's not just about time, it's just not about activity, but you got to mind your energy. Do it holistically. So it's not just physical energy, but also emotional energy, your mental energy, and even your spiritual energy. And again, they don't talk about religion as such, but it's more what's your bigger why as you work on these things. The next piece they talk about is, in their first book, The Corporate Athlete, kind of gets at this, that think of yourself as an athlete. Athletes, they do perform, but they don't perform continuously. They both perform and they recover. They have a rhythm or a pulse to their life. They, again, perform and recover. So what we often forget about in the business life is we're always performing and we're never recovering. And yet, whether it be physical training or anything else, it will tell you, I think the concept in physical training is interval training. You go real hard for a period of time, then you slow down. You go real hard for a period of time, and then you slow down. So again, they really emphasize we need to think about how do we have a rhythm in our lives, not just trying to perform 100% of the time. The other thing they talk about is the power of routines. And again, that's kind of like I talked about with the mini habits. But here again, it's the idea of most of our life or 40% of our activity is by habit. So another way of saying that is the routines. And they talk about how do you consciously create the routines. And it could be a work routine. It could be a personal fitness routine. It could be a study routine. But how do you create those specific routines that will help you succeed and move you towards your goals in 2020? You know, a slightly different take on that is the book, The Elite Road Warrior by Brian Paul Buckley. He has similar themes in there, but it's a little different spin on it for people who travel a lot. And that's back in episode number 27, if you'd like. Now, the next piece I'd like to say about a different way to look at your goals. Again, it's another book. It's The Power of Story. This was by Jim Lohr. But he talks about it's not just, again, the activities, but what's the story we're telling ourselves? What's the story we want to tell ourselves and others? So he says, why don't you actually write down what's your current story? And it could be a story around work, family, health, happiness, or even friends. But some of the stories, listed in the book, just to give a snippet, I'm so busy at work that I'm not present at home. I feel stressed and I'm not getting enough exercise. Boy, I'd like to spend more time with my children. So some of these may be your current story. So then think about how would you write a future story that doesn't have some of these elements in it. And again, as you think about these stories, is it your story or is it someone else's? And then start thinking about the fact is, if you were to do it in a narrative sense, what is it you'd like your story to be at the end of 12 months, in December of 2020? What would be your experience of life? What would be experience of others with respect to your life? Then if you even want to go farther, what do you want said in your eulogy at the end of your life? I bet it's not going to be, well, he hit his quarterly numbers and processed 200 emails a day. Again, be thinking about what's that longer range impact that you want to have. How do you want to spend your life and help others? The final piece I'd like you to consider as you, again, think about 2020 goals is emotional intelligence. There are 12 competencies there, and I went through those in some level of detail in episodes 8 through 11 in the podcast. But again, the 4 domains of emotional intelligence are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. So just to name a few, consider, do you feel yourself to be self-aware of what's going on with yourself as well as others? Do you feel you have emotional self-control, either how you feel for yourself or how you work with others? Are you adaptable? Do you have some level of empathy? And again, that's different than sympathy, but do you actually understand or can you pick up on what emotions other people are feeling? Can you manage conflict well? Or is that something you feel you could be better at in your role as a both husband, father, worker, whatever it may be? And then inspirational leadership. Often as I work with leaders, they want to be able to help their people move into the future. And I think inherently that requires inspirational leadership. So is that a skill you would want to consider developing more of in 2020? So what's to be done? Here's some ideas for you to consider. The first step, I would think, is a thing that I learned from David Allen, who wrote the book Getting Things Done and has had a long run as far as personal productivity. But he talked doing a mind sweep. And so what I'd suggest to do is just sitting down for maybe a couple of 20-minute periods and just writing down all of the things that you think you should do, you want to do, you hope to do, whatever comes to mind. And I think in my experience, when we do this, as you get through and just, again, make it 20 minutes and keep writing, whatever it may be. You may cross all of them off, but keep writing, because what you'll find, I think, is you get away from simply the transactional activities that may fully occupy your mind today and start moving into the transformational type things that really would form your big goals for the new year. And speaking of that, again, going back to classic Stephen Covey and the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, he talks about this idea of big rocks. You have to make time to put the big issues into your schedule or into your mental bucket so that you can get those done. Otherwise, the small stuff will just overwhelm you and you'll never get to it. And again, as he talked in his idea about successful habits, we can only do about 3 to 7 things. So again, I think I've mentioned in earlier podcasts, Jim Collins said, if you have more than 3 priorities, you don't have any priorities. Well, Stephen Covey would give you a little more leeway, but he would say 5 to 7 things are what you can really focus on in a year. And then finally, as you think about what to do with these things you've captured, a lot of people have talked about yearly plans are too big, and it's hard to keep our attention on them, keep our focus on them, and do anything with them. So maybe start thinking of 90-day plans. You can call it a sprint or whatever it might be. A good friend and teacher of mine, Jonathan Milligan, says, make it as simple as doing a weekly big 3 and even a daily big 3, and write them on a Post-it, write them on a note card or something like that. But just make sure you're making small steps on the big goals that you have. Well, that kind of brings to end this episode. I hope you've got some ideas here as to how you could go about looking at your goals, creating your goals, capturing what it is you want to do for 2020. And then we're going to talk more about how you can get off to a strong start in 2020. So the next episode is going to be 4 lenses to look at your goals. To give you a quick preview, once you've got this long list of goals in front of you, what do you do with them? So I did an article about Do More Great Work by Michael Bungay Stanier in episode number 26, where he defines what's great work, good work, and bad work. So we'll talk about that some more in the next episode. And then another book that I recently worked on with actually a men's group is called The Second Mountain by David Brooks. And again, to give the quick highlight on that, he defines the first mountain as probably the mountain of personal achievement that we get to wherever we're at in our lives, but all of a sudden we find that maybe personal achievement isn't the whole picture here. And he suggests that the second mountain, as you move to a commitment to others and higher purposes. And I would paraphrase that for myself is shifting from being good at whatever I am or what I do to doing good for others. So those will be a couple ideas we'll talk about in the next episode. And then in the third episode, we'll talk about could you use a coach? What are the ideas and what are the reasons it might be helpful to have one? And then in that final episode, we'll review what I've tried to share with you in 2019 and at least what my initial ideas for me are to share with you in 2020. So again, thank you for listening. Have a great week.